February 27, 1953. Moscow, 11:47 p.m. The city was already asleep. Snow fell silently over the Kremlin's red walls, and the amber glow of a single lamp still burned somewhere behind the high windows of the Presidium building. Most of the capital had no idea that in a prison cell not far from Lubyanka Square, a man was making the most desperate phone call of his life. Viktor Semyonovich Abakumov, former Minister of State Security, former head of SMERSH, former one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union, sat hunched over a telephone receiver with hands that would not stop trembling. He had been arrested in July of 1951. For nearly 2 years he had rotted in a cell, stripped of his rank, his privileges, his identity. He had watched colleagues confess to things they had never done. He had watched men simply disappear. And now, staring at the wall of his cell, Abakumov had arrived at a cold, calculated conclusion. The only currency left to him was information, and he still had some. The line connected, silence. Then breathing on the other end, deep, patient, unhurried, the way only one man in all of Russia breathed when he was deciding whether you were worth his time. Abakumov began, his voice steadier than his hands. The silence on the other end did not break. It simply stretched, like a wire pulled too tight, about to snap, or about to hold forever. Abakumov pressed on. Quote 2. Still nothing from the other end. But Abakumov knew better than to interpret the silence as disinterest. Stalin's silence was not emptiness. It was a furnace. It consumed everything fed into it and returned nothing until the moment it chose to. "I can deliver the folder personally," Abakumov said. "Tomorrow morning." A pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then, "Come." The line went dead. The folder. The next morning, February 28th, Viktor Abakumov was transported under escort from his detention facility to the Kremlin. The folder he carried was thin, perhaps 40 pages. But in the architecture of Stalinist power, 40 pages could be heavier than a division of tanks. The contents were a masterpiece of constructed evidence, the kind that worked precisely because it was not entirely fabricated. True things and untrue things, pressed together until they became indistinguishable. The Berlin transcripts were real documents, genuine stenographic records from 1945. What Abakumov had done, or what someone had done on his behalf, a question historians still argue, was annotate them, highlight certain phrases, arrange them in sequence so that an isolated sentence here and a footnote there formed a picture that did not exist in the original, but felt entirely plausible. The inventory of trophies was similarly constructed. Zhukov had indeed returned from Berlin with more than his uniform. That was not a secret. It was a documented fact. But the numbers in Abakumov's version were inflated, the context stripped away, the framing shifted from quote 6 to quote 737 paintings, 120 kilograms of silver. A detail like that does not require proof. It requires only repetition. The man at the other end of the silence. What Abakumov could not see, what no one in that transaction could see, was Stalin's face as he received the folder. It was a face that revealed nothing. That was not an accident of personality. It was a lifelong discipline. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had spent decades perfecting the art of the unreadable response. He had learned early that power does not announce itself. It waits. It allows others to reveal themselves. It collects. It files. It returns only when it chooses to, and on its own terms. He read the folder slowly. He did not rush. He turned pages the way a man reviews a contract he already intends to sign, not to discover what it says, but to find the precise point at which it becomes useful. He set it down. He did not speak immediately. This was the mechanics of blackmail in Stalin's system, and it ran in every direction simultaneously. Here was a man who had been imprisoned, a man facing potential execution, offering the head of one of the most celebrated generals in Soviet history in exchange for his own survival. The logic was simple and ancient. I cannot save myself, but I can make myself valuable. I cannot escape the trap, but I can offer you a better trap for someone else. What made Abakumov's gambit so elegant and so dangerous was its internal consistency. A lie dressed in truth is far more lethal than a lie alone. The Berlin transcripts existed. The trophy inventory had a factual basis. The phrase about the responsibility of the military, whether genuinely alarming in context or entirely mundane, now carried a charge it had never originally held. Abakumov sat across the desk. Stalin looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for a red pencil. He did not write on the folder. He wrote on a small notepad beside it. One name, underlined once, Zhukov. What silence costs. Abakumov left the Kremlin alive. He would not remain so forever. But for this moment, on this morning, at the end of February in the last year of Stalin's life, he had bought himself something. Time. Perhaps weeks. Perhaps months. He did not know, could not know, that he had just placed a chess piece on a board where he himself was already a pawn. The game that was about to begin in the Kremlin was not about Zhukov's paintings. It was not about Berlin transcripts or silver tableware. It was about who would survive the coming storm. And the storm was already forming, not in the corridors of the MGB, not in the files of the Politburo, but in the body of an aging man who sat alone in his Kremlin office late at night, a red pencil in his hand, surrounded by papers about enemies real and imagined. The phone had rung at 11:47 in the evening. By midnight, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, conqueror of Berlin, the man who had stood at the Brandenburg Gate while half of Europe still smoldered, had already become a target. He just didn't know it yet. March 1st, 1953. Kremlin, 9:14 a.m. The folder had been sitting on the desk since the previous evening, untouched, waiting, the way a loaded weapon waits, patient and indifferent, for the hand that will decide what to do with it. Stalin arrived at his office at 9 in the morning, which was late by his own standards and early by everyone else's. He had not slept well. In recent months his sleep had become fractured, shallow, full of sounds that weren't there. He was 73 years old, and his body had begun to betray him in small ways he refused to acknowledge. His left hand trembled occasionally. His memory, once a weapon of terrifying precision, sometimes slipped on names. Not important names, not the names that mattered, but names nonetheless. He sat. He poured tea. He opened the folder again. But this time he was not reading about Berlin transcripts or silver inventories. He had set Abakumov's documents aside. What lay open before him now was something different. A personnel file, thick and worn at the edges, assembled over many years by many hands. A file that had been updated, annotated, and revisited more times than almost any other in the building. The file of Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. The red pencil. Stalin read slowly and with complete attention. The kind of attention that most men reserve for financial documents or medical diagnoses. He was not reading for facts. He already knew the facts. He had known them for years. What he was reading for was something more precise. Pattern. The recurring shape of a man's behavior across 20 years of pressure, crisis, triumph, and humiliation. He reached for the red pencil. On the margin of a page describing Zhukov's conduct during the 1946 investigation, the first time the Marshal had faced serious accusations about the Berlin trophies, Stalin wrote a single word. Gordost. Pride. He underlined it twice. He turned several more pages. A transcript of a Politburo session from 1948, in which Zhukov had reportedly interrupted a superior officer mid-sentence to correct a factual error. A report from a subordinate general describing how the marshal had responded to a reprimand by going completely silent and then, 3 days later, submitting a 17-page counter-argument through official channels. Stalin wrote in the margin, "Easily destabilized. Direct pressure produces immediate reaction." He turned another page. A psychological evaluation prepared by MGB consultants in 1949, a document Zhukov himself had never seen and never would see, described the marshal's core vulnerabilities with clinical detachment. The author, whose name had been redacted even in Stalin's copy, had written, "Subject demonstrates exceptional strategic intelligence combined with near-total incapacity for political maneuvering." When confronted with moral accusation rather than factual disagreement, subject lacks the tools to respond neutrally. He escalates. Stalin read that sentence twice. Then he wrote in the margin, "Not capable of intrigue." 3 words. Underlined once. A verdict. The scenario. By 11 in the morning, Stalin had moved from reading to writing. What he produced over the next 2 hours was not a formal document. It had no official header, no signature line, no protocol number. It was written in his own hand on plain paper, a series of notes organized into what could only be described as a theatrical script. 3 acts, 3 stages, each designed not to extract a confession but to produce a specific emotional state in the subject. Stage 1. Comfort. Begin with warmth. Stalingrad, Kursk, the road to Berlin. Remind Zhukov of his own greatness, not as flattery, but as foundation. A man who feels recognized lowers his guard. A man who feels valued stops calculating. Let him believe for 15 or 20 minutes that this is a meeting between equals who share a common history. Stage 2. The document. Introduce the folder without drama. Place it on the table as if it were incidental, a minor administrative matter that has somehow found its way into the conversation. Read one passage aloud, casually. Watch the reaction. The first reaction is always the most honest one. Stage 3. The corner. Do not accuse. Suggest. Let the accusation form in Zhukov's own mind. Ask questions that have no clean answer. Reference the circle of loyal officers without defining it. Allow the phrase conspiracy to enter the room without being spoken directly. Wait. A direct man cannot survive ambiguity. He will move to fill it. And in filling it, he will make a mistake. Stalin looked at what he had written. He set down the pencil. He lit his pipe. The plan was not about guilt or innocence. It never had been. The plan was about producing a reaction, a specific, visible, recordable reaction that could be interpreted afterward as evidence of whatever needed to be proven. The order to Vlasic. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, Stalin summoned the chief of his personal guard. Nikolai Sidorovich Vlasic had served Stalin for nearly 3 decades. He was not an intelligent man in any sophisticated sense, but he was a profoundly loyal one, and in the Kremlin ecosystem, loyalty without intelligence was often more useful than the reverse. He understood orders. He did not ask questions about their purpose. Stalin gave him 3 instructions. First, the small conference room adjoining the main office was to be prepared for a private meeting scheduled for the evening of March 2nd. The room was to be swept and checked. Then, and this was the second instruction, 2 recording devices were to be installed in the room before the meeting. Not the standard fixed microphones that were built into the walls of most Kremlin rooms. Portable units, concealed. Third, all vehicle exits from the inner Kremlin compound were to be administratively restricted between the hours of 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning on March 2nd. No exceptions, no explanations to be given to drivers or security personnel. Vlasic nodded at each instruction. He did not write anything down. He never did. He kept everything in his head, which was both his greatest professional virtue and, in this particular moment, his greatest liability. He was, without knowing it, being made complicit in something whose full shape he could not see. He left. Stalin returned to the file. What the file could not show. There is a strange irony buried in this moment that only becomes visible in retrospect. Stalin was studying Zhukov the way a chess player studies the board, calculating responses, mapping vulnerabilities, engineering outcomes. He was, by any measure, the superior political operator. He had survived things that would have destroyed any other man. He had outlasted rivals of genuine intelligence and ruthlessness. He had turned the entire apparatus of the Soviet state into an extension of his own psychology. And yet, the file on his desk could tell him how Zhukov responded to accusation. It could not tell him how Zhukov might respond to desperation. It could map the marshal's pride, his directness, his inability to dissemble. What it could not map was what a cornered man with nothing left to lose might reach for, what card he might play that no analyst had thought to include in a personnel dossier. Stalin closed the file at 2:30 in the afternoon. He had everything he needed for March 2nd, or so he believed. Outside, snow continued to fall over Moscow. Somewhere across the city, Georgy Zhukov was preparing for what he had been told was a routine meeting with the Supreme Commander, a brief conversation about Southern Military District reorganization. He had no reason to be afraid. That, of course, was exactly how it was supposed to feel. March 2nd, 1953. Moscow, 8:51 p.m. The black ZES limousine moved through the Kremlin gates at 8:51 in the evening, 9 minutes ahead of schedule, because Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was always early. It was a soldier's habit, bred into him across 4 decades of military discipline. You arrived before the appointed hour. You never made a commander wait. He did not know, as the car passed through the inner checkpoint, that the vehicle exits behind him had just been quietly sealed. The night was cold and clear. Stars were visible above the Senate Tower. Zhukov stepped out of the car, straightened his greatcoat, adjusted the gold stars on his epaulets, 4 of them, each one earned in blood and fire, and walked toward the entrance with the unhurried confidence of a man who had liberated Berlin. He had been to this building hundreds of times. He knew these corridors. He knew the smell of the carpets, the particular echo of boots on the stone floor, the way the overhead lights made everyone look slightly ill. A junior aide met him at the door and led him not to the main conference hall, but to the smaller adjoining room. Zhukov noted the change without concern. Informal, then. A private conversation. That was fine. He preferred directness. He did not notice the 2 small objects positioned behind the decorative panels on either side of the room. Stage 1. The warmth. Stalin was already seated when Zhukov entered. He rose, which was unusual and which Zhukov registered somewhere in the back of his mind as significant without knowing why. The old man looked tired, smaller than memory suggested, as he always did in person. But the eyes were the same, dark, still, measuring everything. Georgy Konstantinovich. The voice was warm. Genuinely warm, or something indistinguishable from it. Sit down. There is tea. They sat across from each other at the small table. For a moment neither man spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had shared something enormous. The kind of shared experience that creates its own language, beyond words. Then Stalin said, "Do you remember the Stalingrad corridor, November of 42, the moment the ring closed?" Zhukov smiled despite himself. "I remember the radio report. Rokossovsky's voice. He could barely speak." "He cried," Stalin said. "Did you know that?" "He cried, and then immediately pretended he had not." They both laughed. It was a real laugh, brief, genuine, belonging to a different version of this relationship than the one that was about to begin. For 17 minutes they talked about the war, Kursk and the tank engagement at Prokhorovka, The crossing of the Oder in January of 45. The final approach to Berlin. The maps spread across the table in the forward command post. The arguments about the axis of advance. The moment when the outcome ceased to be uncertain and became inevitable. Stalin was precise in his recollections. He remembered details Zhukov had forgotten. He remembered the names of junior officers who had distinguished themselves in small engagements that history would never record. Zhukov felt something he had not expected to feel. Ease, something close to warmth. He had spent years on the periphery, in Odessa, in the Urals, semi-exiled, watched, his correspondence monitored, his visitors noted. He had grown accustomed to distance. And now here was the old man, talking about the war as if it still belonged to both of them equally. He lowered his guard. That was exactly the moment Stalin had been waiting for. Stage 2. The document. The transition was so smooth that Zhukov almost missed it. Stalin reached to the side of the table, not dramatically, not with any signal of what was coming, and placed a thin folder on the surface between them. He did it the way you set down a cup of tea. Incidental. Routine. "There is a small matter," he said, in the same conversational tone he had used to discuss Rokossovsky's tears. Zhukov looked at the folder. Something cold moved through him. Not fear yet, but its precursor. A biological signal, older than thought. Quote 16, he said. Stalin opened the folder and read aloud. Not the entire document, just a passage. A paragraph from what appeared to be a stenographic record. Berlin, July of 1945. A conversation between Zhukov and a British liaison officer. The words, read in Stalin's flat, unhurried voice, sounded like something they were not in their original context, something that could be interpreted, if one were inclined, as an expression of independent political ambition, as a suggestion that the military had its own view of the post-war order. Then Stalin turned a page and mentioned the inventory. 37 paintings, 120 kilograms of silver. He did not accuse. He simply read the numbers. Then he looked up. "Can you help me understand this?" he asked pleasantly. Stage 3, the corner. What happened next happened fast. Faster than Zhukov had intended. Faster than any soldier should allow himself to move in a room he does not control. "Those transcripts are incomplete," Zhukov said. His voice was steady. "The context has been removed. That conversation concerned the logistics of the Allied occupation zones. Nothing more. And the inventory." "The inventory was prepared by the MGB," Stalin said mildly. "In 1946. You were shown a copy at the time." "I was shown a different copy. The numbers in that document are not the numbers I was shown." Stalin made a small sound that was not agreement or disagreement. He turned another page. "And the circle of officers? The ones you met with in Frankfurt in August of 45? "A dinner," Zhukov said. "A formal military dinner with Allied commanders." "Of course," Stalin nodded slowly. "And the phrase, the one your aide recorded in his personal notes, about who would carry responsibility for Europe if the political leadership proved inadequate?" Silence. Zhukov stared at him. The phrase had not been in the Berlin transcript. It had come from somewhere else. A private conversation. A dinner table remark. Something said in the way soldiers speak to each other when they believe no one official is listening. Something dragged out of context and sharpened into a weapon. "That is a distortion," Zhukov said. The steadiness in his voice was beginning to cost him something. He could feel it. The heat rising from his chest into his throat. "That is a deliberate distortion of Georgy Konstantinovich." Stalin's voice was gentle, almost compassionate. __quote _32 __. And that was the moment. That precise, calculated, perfectly engineered moment. when the word accusations appeared in the room without being formally deployed, when the shape of what was being constructed became visible for just a fraction of a second. Zhukov's fist came down on the table, not hard enough to be called anything other than what it was. A soldier's gesture, a man who had spent his entire life resolving impossibilities through force of will, now confronting something that force of will could not resolve. The tea glasses rattled, the folder shifted, the two concealed recording devices captured everything. Quote 33. His voice filled the room. Quote 34, quote 35. Stalin's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It remained exactly what it had been for the past 40 minutes. Calm, measured, unhurried. The voice of a man who has already won. Zhukov sat down. He was breathing hard. His hands were flat on the table. He stared at Stalin, and Stalin looked back at him with an expression that was very nearly kind. The expression of a doctor who has just confirmed a diagnosis he expected. In the margins of his notes, prepared the previous morning, Stalin had written, "Not capable of intrigue." He had been right. The outburst had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It would be replayed, analyzed, and referenced for the rest of Zhukov's life. Not because it proved guilt, but because in the architecture of Stalinist power, losing control of yourself in that room, in front of that man, was its own form of confession. Not of what you had done, of who you were. And who you were was all that mattered. The trap had closed. The marshal sat across the table, chest heaving, stars gleaming on his shoulders, and he understood, in the way that great soldiers sometimes understand defeat before the final blow, that he had just lost something. He did not yet know what. He did not yet know how much. He did not know that the most important move of the evening had not yet been played. That move was still his. March 2nd, 1953. Kremlin, 10:38 p.m. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt permanent. Zhukov's outburst had lasted less than a minute. But in the Kremlin's small conference room, with two concealed microphones running and Stalin watching from across the table with the patience of a man who has spent his entire life waiting for exactly this kind of moment, 30 seconds was an eternity. Long enough to record, long enough to file, long enough to build an entire case around, if the case was ever needed. Zhukov knew this. He had known it the moment his fist hit the table. Known it the way a soldier knows, in the fraction of a second after a wrong decision, that the situation has fundamentally changed. You cannot unsay what has been said. You cannot uncreate what has been captured. The only thing left to a man in that position is to change the terms of the game entirely. He took a slow breath. He straightened in his chair. He placed both hands flat on the table, a deliberate, visible act of control, a signal to himself as much as to the man across from him. And then Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, the most decorated military commander in Russian history, did the only thing a cornered soldier can do when he cannot fight forward. He opened a second front. The name Zhukov said. His voice was quiet now. The heat had gone out of it, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. Quote 37. Stalin did not move. He did not speak. He simply waited. That furnace silence, consuming everything. Quote 38. Zhukov said. Quote 39. The air in the room changed. Not dramatically. There was no sharp intake of breath, no visible reaction from the man across the table. But something shifted, the way pressure shifts before a storm. Zhukov felt it, and pressed forward. Quote 40. Stalin's eyes did not blink. Beria spoke about your health in terms that were not... Zhukov chose the next word with surgical precision. Respectful. He used the word inevitable. He discussed timelines. He mentioned a specific scenario involving a medical episode. a stroke. He mentioned that the Kremlin physicians had been given certain instructions regarding emergency protocols, instructions that would ensure a delay in response. He used the phrase "a window of several hours." The silence that followed lasted a long time. Stalin reached slowly for his pencil. He did not look down at the paper. He kept his eyes on Zhukov's face. Then he wrote something. One word, then another, without looking at what he was writing. Quote 43, Stalin said finally. His voice was entirely unchanged. Flat, quiet, bearing no more emotion than a man reading a train schedule. Zhukov gave it. Zhukov gave both names. Stalin set the pencil down. He looked at what he had written. 4 names, arranged in a column, each underlined once. He studied them for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing an unexpected invoice, calculating whether the numbers were correct. The calculation. What happened in those next few minutes, in the silence between 2 men in a room that history would never officially acknowledge, was not recorded in any document that has been fully declassified. What we have are fragments, a reference in Zhukov's private diary written years later describing the moment Stalin set down his pencil, a single line in a Politburo memo from March 3rd that references an unscheduled addition to a personnel review, and the outcome itself, which speaks more clearly than any transcript. But the calculation was not difficult to reconstruct. Stalin was looking at a man who had just committed 2 acts simultaneously. The first act was a confession. The outburst, the fist on the table, the visible emotional collapse, all of it now preserved on magnetic tape behind the decorative panels. That tape could be used at any time, for any purpose, to demonstrate whatever it needed to demonstrate. The second act was something entirely different. It was a delivery. A piece of information that, true, false, or somewhere in the vast gray territory between the two, was precisely the kind of information Stalin could not dismiss. Not because he trusted Zhukov. He did not need to trust the source. He needed only to ask himself, what if it is true? What is the cost of ignoring it? And the cost of ignoring a specific, named, dated accusation against Lavrentiy Beria, the man who controlled the secret police, the man who knew more about more people than anyone else alive, the man whose loyalty had always been the most transactional and therefore the most uncertain of all, was a cost Stalin could not afford to absorb. He had not survived 73 years by ignoring specific, named, dated accusations. He picked up the pencil again. He drew a slow line beneath the 4 names. Then he wrote a 5th name beside them, smaller, with a question mark. Beria, the window of several hours. There is a particular cruelty in the phrase Zhukov attributed to Beria that night. A window of several hours. It is the kind of phrase that, once heard, cannot be unheard. It does not require proof. It requires only imagination. And Stalin's imagination, where threats to his person were concerned, had always been extraordinarily vivid. Whether the gathering of January 14th had occurred as Zhukov described it is a question historians have debated for 7 decades. The general officer named that evening later denied all knowledge of it. One of the 2 MGB officers died in custody before he could be fully questioned. The residence owner was transferred to a posting in Central Asia within 3 weeks and never returned to Moscow. What is not debated is the outcome. Stalin looked at Zhukov across the table. The folder of Berlin transcripts and silver inventory still lay between them, its accusations unresolved, its implications intact. It had not gone away. Zhukov was not absolved of anything. The trap had not opened. But the geometry of the room had shifted. Quote 49, Stalin said. His tone was the same as it had been all evening, flat, patient, carrying no more heat than the tea that had long since gone cold. Zhukov understood immediately. Odessa. Not Siberia. Not Lubyanka. Not the basement corridor that so many men had walked into and never walked out of. Odessa. A real command, a real city, a real post with a real desk and real subordinates and a real window overlooking a real sea. A golden cage. The most elegant form of political elimination available in the Soviet arsenal. Removal without destruction. Exile without the formality of exile. A life preserved in aspic at a careful distance from the center of everything. Quote 51, Zhukov said. He stood. He straightened his coat. He adjusted the 4 gold stars on his epaulettes. The same unconscious gesture he had made getting out of the car nearly 2 hours earlier, in what felt now like a different lifetime. Stalin did not rise. He was already looking at the notepad, at the 5 names arranged in a column, at the question mark beside the last one. Zhukov walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle. He paused for just a moment, not for drama, not for effect, but because something in him needed one more second in this room, one more breath of this particular air, before the door opened and the rest of his life began. Then he walked out into the corridor. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, final click. Behind the decorative panels, 2 concealed recording devices continued to run in silence, capturing the sound of Stalin alone in the room, the scratch of a pencil, the turn of a page, the slow exhale of a man who has just received information that has changed, in ways he cannot yet fully calculate, the shape of everything that comes next. Outside, the vehicle exits had been unsealed. The black Zis was waiting. Zhukov got in. The car moved through the Kremlin gates into the Moscow night. March 3rd, 1953. Odessa Highway. 6:47 a.m. The convoy moved south through the pre-dawn darkness. 3 vehicles, headlights cutting through the thin morning fog that lay across the steppe like a held breath. In the middle car, Georgy Zhukov sat upright against the leather seat, watching the frozen fields move past the window, saying nothing. He had not slept. He kept returning to the same moment. The scratch of Stalin's pencil, the 5 names in a column, the question mark beside the last one. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone, looking for what lives underneath. He did not know if what he had said about Beria was enough. He did not know if enough was even a category that applied to what had happened in that room. He knew only that he was in a car moving away from Moscow, and that as long as the car kept moving, he was alive, and that alive was the only victory available to him. At 6:47 in the morning, somewhere on the Odessa highway, his aide tapped him on the shoulder and handed him a folded message that had just come through on the vehicle radio. Zhukov read it once. Then he read it again. General Secretary Stalin has been taken ill. He is under medical supervision at Kuntsevo. He folded the message. He placed it in his breast pocket, against his chest. He looked back out the window at the frozen fields. He said nothing. What happened at Kuntsevo? The official account, as it was eventually released to the Soviet public and the world, was clean and simple. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin suffered a severe cerebral hemorrhage sometime during the night of March 1st to 2nd, was discovered by household staff the following evening, received immediate medical attention, and died on the 5th of March at 9:51 p.m., surrounded by members of the Presidium. Every sentence in that account contains a problem. The first problem is the timeline. According to the testimony of the Kuntsevo household staff, testimony that was suppressed for decades and emerged only in fragments through later historical research, Stalin was last seen at approximately 11 p.m. on the night of March 1st. He did not emerge from his private rooms the following morning, which was unusual but not unprecedented. He sometimes worked through the night and slept through the morning. The staff waited. They did not enter the room. By 7 in the evening of March 2nd, nearly 20 hours after he had last been seen, a duty officer finally opened the door. He found Stalin on the floor of his private dining room, conscious but unable to speak or move, his left side paralyzed, his clothing damp, his face turned toward the window. The duty officer did not call a doctor. he called Beria. The second theory. Beria arrived at Kuntsevo approximately 90 minutes later, accompanied by Malenkov. They stood at the door of the room. They looked at the man on the floor, the man who had shaped every hour of their adult lives, who had made them and could unmake them, who had signed the orders that had emptied entire cities, and they conferred in low voices in the hallway for a period that witnesses estimated at between 40 minutes and 2 hours. Physicians were not summoned until the morning of March 3rd. This gap, between the discovery and the medical response, is the beating heart of the second theory. The theory is not that anyone in that hallway administered anything, arranged anything, or acted in any aggressive fashion. The theory is simpler and in some ways more disturbing. That a group of men, looking at their dying master, made a collective and unspoken decision not to hurry. Beria reportedly said, upon entering the room and seeing Stalin on the floor, something that was remembered differently by everyone present. One account records him saying, "He is sleeping, do not disturb him." Another account records a longer sentence, something about the physicians being summoned at the appropriate hour. A third witness recalled no words at all, only that Beria had looked at the body on the floor and then looked away, and that something in the quality of that look was different from grief. He was smiling, that third witness said, or perhaps he was simply not crying, and in that room, on that night, the absence of tears looked like a smile. The third theory. Zhukov, in his private diary, written in installments across the last 2 decades of his life, never intended for publication, recovered and partially declassified after his death in 1974, described his own understanding of Stalin's death in language that is careful to the point of obliqueness. He wrote, "I have come to believe that no single person bears the specific responsibility that history tends to assign in such cases. What happened at Kuntsevo was not a conspiracy in the formal sense. It was an atmosphere, a collective permission. Men who had lived for years in absolute terror of one man found themselves, in a single night, holding power over his survival, and discovered that the terror had not prepared them to act decisively on his behalf. They did not kill him. They simply did not save him. And in the arithmetic of that particular moment, the two were equivalent." He added, in a passage written several years later and marked with a different pen, as if returned to, "I have also considered the possibility that the information I provided on the evening of March 2nd accelerated what Beria had already decided, that by naming him, I gave him less time and more reason to act. That I was, without knowing it, not a witness to what followed but a participant in it. This thought has never left me entirely." The funeral. Stalin died on the 5th of March at 9:51 in the evening. The announcement was made to the Soviet people the following morning. Millions wept, genuinely, uncontrollably, with a grief that was real even when it was also irrational, the way grief for a tyrant can be real because what people mourn is not the tyrant himself, but the enormous and terrible certainty he represented. Without him, the future was suddenly without shape. Zhukov arrived in Moscow for the state funeral on March 9th. He stood in the Hall of Columns among the gathered marshals and generals, in full dress uniform, his 4 gold stars gleaming under the funeral lights. Around him, men who had trembled in Kremlin offices for 20 years stood with carefully arranged expressions of sorrow. He saw Beria across the room. Beria stood near the front of the gathering, close to the bier, in a dark suit with his trademark pince-nez glasses and his characteristic posture, slightly forward-leaning, attentive, alert. He was speaking quietly to Malenkov. His expression was composed. Zhukov watched him for a long moment. He thought about the phrase, "a window of several hours." He thought about the duty officer who had called Beria instead of a doctor. He thought about the 40 minutes, or 90 minutes, or 2 hours in the hallway at Kuntsevo while a man lay on a floor 40 feet away. He thought about his own words in that Kremlin conference room 7 days earlier, and the question mark Stalin had drawn beside a name, and whether that question mark had changed anything, or whether everything had already been decided long before Zhukov had ever opened his mouth. He could not know. He would never know. What he could see from across the hall of columns was this. Beria turned slightly, as if sensing the attention. His eyes found Zhukov's across the crowded room, and for just a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps less, something passed between them. Not a message, not a threat. Something more ambiguous and more permanent than either. Recognition. Then Beria looked away. Malenkov leaned in to say something. The ceremony continued. Outside, Moscow wept in the cold March air. Inside, the men who had survived, and the men who had, in their various ways, ensured they would survive, stood in their dark suits and their dress uniforms and waited for the new world to begin. Zhukov stood among them, alive, present, already fading from the center of power toward its edge. The golden cage was waiting in Odessa. The door, he knew, would not be locked from the outside. It never was, in this system. You simply found, over time, that you could not leave. Moscow, State Archive of the Russian Federation, September 11th, 2023, 9:02 a.m. The folder arrived on the reading room table in a gray, acid-free box, sealed with a strip of bureaucratic tape that someone had stamped with a date in blue ink. Declassified. Partial. Access authorized under Presidential Decree 647-R. The word partial was underlined by hand, which meant that somewhere in this building, in a room Andrei Sokolov would never enter, another box existed containing the rest. Sokolov was 51 years old, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Russian History, the author of 4 books about the late Stalin period, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades learning to read Soviet documents the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not for what was visible, but for what the visible things implied about what lay beneath. He cut the tape. He opened the box. He began to read. What he found inside would occupy him for the next 4 months, reshape 2 chapters of the book he was writing, and leave him, on certain evenings, sitting at his kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, staring at nothing, turning over a single question that had no clean answer. What the archive contained. The declassified materials of September 2023 represented the largest single release of late Stalin-era Kremlin documents in 11 years. They included partial transcripts of Politburo sessions from January through March of 1953, a set of handwritten notes recovered from Stalin's personal desk following his death, 3 pages of internal MGB correspondence dated February 28 through March 1st, and, most significantly, a series of diary entries by Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov covering the period from March of 1953 through December of 1958. The diary had been known to exist for decades. Fragments had circulated among historians in samizdat form since the 1980s. But the original, in Zhukov's own hand, across 47 pages of a standard military notebook, had remained classified. Now, with certain passages still redacted in heavy black ink that told its own story about what the state considered too sensitive to release, even 70 years later, it was finally available. Sokolov read it in a single sitting. Zhukov's own words. The early entries from 1953 are careful, controlled, written in the voice of a man who knows, even in private, that privacy is not guaranteed. He describes Odessa in brief, factual terms. The weather, the military district's organizational needs, the view from his office window. He does not mention Moscow. He does not mention the Kremlin. He does not mention the night of March 2nd. Then, in an entry dated June of 1953, 3 months after Stalin's death, 2 weeks after Beria's arrest. The voice changes. Zhukov wrote, "They have taken Beria. The charges are the usual architecture: espionage, treason, crimes against the state. Whether any of it is specifically true is less important than the fact that all of it is generally true, in the sense that it describes the man accurately, even if it does not describe his actual crimes. He will be shot. He will be shot not for what he did, but for what he knew." This is a distinction that history will erase, because history requires clean reasons, and the real reason, that he was the only man alive who held enough of the truth to destroy everyone around him, is not the kind of reason that appears in official verdicts. Sokolov read this paragraph 4 times. Then he turned the page. In an entry from 1957, written during the period when Khrushchev had moved against the so-called anti-party group and Zhukov himself was briefly the most powerful military figure in the Soviet Union, Zhukov returned to the night of March 2nd with a directness he had not previously allowed himself. He wrote, "I have considered at length whether I was used, whether the information I provided that evening, the names, the dates, the phrase about the window of several hours, was information I arrived at independently, or whether it was placed in my path by someone who understood that I would carry it precisely where it needed to go. A direct man, a soldier, someone Stalin would not immediately disbelieve, someone with enough credibility to make the accusation land, and enough political weakness to be discarded afterward, regardless of outcome." He continued, "I do not know the answer. I have never known the answer. What I know is that Beria was arrested 4 months after I spoke those words, and that the men who arrested him, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, had been planning his removal for longer than those 4 months, which means they needed Stalin distracted from his own plans during the final days of February and the first days of March, distracted by something that felt urgent, something that pointed in a different direction." The next line was partially redacted. What remained visible was, "If that is what I was, a piece of misdirection, a card played by someone else's hand, then I survived not because of what I knew, but because of what I was made to say." Below the redaction, in smaller handwriting that looked like it had been added later, "And yet I am alive," which is more than can be said for most. The Fates. Sokolov set the diary down and looked at the ceiling of the reading room for a long moment. He thought about what the archive had given him, and what it had withheld, and whether the two together told a coherent story or simply a compelling one, which is not the same thing, though history has always struggled to maintain the distinction. He thought about the players and their endings. Viktor Abakumov, who had made the phone call, who had carried the folder, who had traded Zhukov's head for a few additional months of life, was executed in December of 1954. He was shot in the courtyard of Leningrad prison on the 19th of December. He was 51 years old. The charges against him were real and the crimes were genuine, which did not make his execution justice so much as coincidence. Lavrentiy Beria was arrested in June of 1953 and shot in December of the same year, 6 months after his arrest. An unusually swift timeline even by Soviet standards, suggesting that the men conducting the process were not interested in what he might reveal during a prolonged investigation. He was executed in a basement. The officer who fired the shot reportedly stuffed a cloth into Beria's mouth first, because Beria would not stop talking and no one wanted to hear what he was trying to say. Nikolai Vlasic, the guard commander who had installed the microphones and sealed the vehicle exits, was arrested in December of 1952. Before the events of the story had even concluded, convicted of corruption and sentenced to exile. He was rehabilitated in 1956 and died in 1967, leaving memoirs that were published only after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov survived everything. He was dismissed from his post as defense minister in 1957 by Khrushchev, who feared his popularity The same quality that had made him dangerous to Stalin made him dangerous to every successor. He retired. He wrote his memoirs. He received visitors. He sat in his apartment in Moscow and watched, across the following decade and a half, as the country he had fought for transformed itself in ways he did not always understand or approve of. He died on the 18th of June, 1974. He was 77 years old. He was given a state funeral and buried in the Kremlin wall. His private diary was confiscated from his apartment on the day of his death. It remained classified for 49 years. The question that remains. Sokolov closed the gray acid-free box at 7 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. He had been reading for 5 hours. The reading room was nearly empty. A young archivist was replacing folders on a cart near the far wall. Dust moved in the light from the high windows. He thought about what the documents had confirmed, and what they had deepened, and what they had made permanently unanswerable. The official theory of Stalin's death, natural causes, a cerebral hemorrhage, tragic but medically unremarkable for a 73-year-old man who had lived under extreme stress for decades, remained technically intact. No document in any archive had ever produced a direct refutation of the natural causes conclusion. The second theory was that Beria actively arranged what happened, that the delay at Kuntsevo was not indifference but intention, remained unproven in any formal sense, supported by the weight of circumstantial evidence and the testimony of people who had every reason to be believed and no reliable way to be verified. But it was the third theory that stayed with Sokolov on the metro ride home. The theory that Zhukov himself had articulated in his diary. Not murder, not passive negligence. Something more complex and more human than either. A group of men, each of them rational, each of them afraid, each of them calculating their own survival, who looked at a situation and collectively, without coordination, without conspiracy, without a single spoken agreement, allowed it to resolve in the direction that served them best. No heroes, no villains in the clean narrative sense. Only players, moving through a system none of them fully understood, making decisions whose consequences extended far beyond their own sightlines. In Big Politics, Zhukov had written, there are no heroes. There are only players who do not know all the rules. Sokolov emerged from the metro into the September evening. Moscow moved around him. Cars, voices, the smell of rain on pavement. 70 years had passed since the night of March 2, 1953. The city had rebuilt itself a dozen times over. The empire those men had served and feared and navigated had come apart and been partially reassembled, and was now something else again. Something whose relationship to that Kremlin room was genetic rather than direct. And yet the room was still there, in some essential sense. The dynamics were still there. The mechanisms were still there. The file with the red pencil notations, the concealed microphone behind the decorative panel, the man who survives not because he is innocent, but because he makes himself useful at precisely the right moment, the silence that is more powerful than any accusation. Sokolov stopped on the pavement. He took out his notebook. He wrote one sentence. The tragedy is not that we cannot know what happened. The tragedy is that we recognize it. He put the notebook away. He walked home through the September rain. Behind him, in the State Archive reading room, the gray acid-free box sat on the table, waiting to be returned to its shelf, where it would wait for the next historian, and the one after that, each of them arriving with new questions, and leaving with the same permanent, essential uncertainty. The partial truth, underlined by hand. The rest still locked away somewhere in a room they would never enter. He was alive. For now, in this empire, that was enough.